Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this live presentation of the UC Master Gardener program celebrating Healthy Soils Week. Today, Marissa Coyne, myself, we're joined by Dustin Blakey, who is the County Director, Farm Advisor, and Master Gardener Advisor in Inyo and Mono counties. And in celebration of Healthy Soils Week, Dustin's going to be sharing with us some tips to keep our garden soil healthy. So Dustin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to do this. This is my first live webinar, so hopefully it works well for me and for people who are watching it. We'll see how this goes and work together through it.
You made it this far, so we're grateful for that.
Yeah. All right. So let's get going. We'll do questions at the end, but let's start off with this. So, three things I kind of wanted to go over is some philosophy about gardening and garden soils, then talk a little bit about how you can find out more about your native soil, and then the part you're probably most interested in is just some tips about healthy garden soils. So let's get into this. So about 20 years ago, I started working with gardeners, and I started working in extension with a background in production agriculture. So I thought about things like farming, right? So I had some experience with gardening, of course, and I always, growing up and working in the garden, I always thought of my garden as like a little farm, right? I had nice little rows and I tilled up the soil and we put fertilizer in and sprayed it and did all that stuff that a farmer would do. And when I started working with gardeners more, I came to realize that paradigm of thinking about how gardening and soils work doesn't really work real well in the garden situation. I mean, a farmer has to consider things like, what can your soil, produce in your climate? You can't just grow anything. It's got to be profitable. And you're really limited to what you can put in. I mean, we do soil testing to figure out the optimum amount of fertilizer. You want to, not spend more than you have to because you're trying to make a profit. And then I realized that that's probably not really applicable to like actual garden situations. And there's a couple things that kind of cemented in my mind that gardens are not just little farms. And the first was, there was a gentleman that came to me not too far after I started, working in extension. And this person had some pecan trees, and he really wanted pecans on his trees, and he was always getting wiped out with disease. And through the course of the conversation, I determined that he was willing to spend hundreds of dollars to have somebody come and spray his trees to get about $40 worth of pecans. And, that kind of got me thinking that, there's more to this than just someone necessarily being rational about, what we want to get out of the garden. I mean, there's a sense of pride in, having his own source of pecans, because I actually offered him, for $100, I'd go buy some pecans for him and pocket the rest of the money, but he really wasn't interested in that. So that kind of got me thinking about, this is not the right way to think about helping people be successful in the garden with the way they want to be successful. The other thing is I was in Arkansas, and we have essentially free soil testing. You can get your soil tested, and we will, send it to the lab, and we'll give you a nice, optimum agronomic soil recommendation that that should give you just the right amount of nutrients. And usually when someone came to the extension office, it's because they were having a problem in the garden and they wanted to get the optimum, whatever it is that's clearly missing from their garden, to get those great tomatoes or corn or whatever it is they were interested in. But over the course of many years there, I looked at hundreds and hundreds of soil test results, and there was a definite clear pattern that came through. About a fifth of the gardeners had nothing in their soil. They usually were new gardeners just starting out, but almost everybody had way too much nutrition. I mean, sending in a soil test to get the optimum nutrition was kind of pointless because they already had, pretty much everything they needed and more in their garden. And, because I saw this pattern and I wanted to confirm, is this really a thing? Or is Destin just like off the rails here? More than once, I got the soil test data from the lab itself, and you can still, through a weird quirk of how Arkansas works, you can download that data. And I did that recently. This is all the garden soil test results in the state of Arkansas for June 2018. So there's a lot of results here. And just looking at phosphorus, because I picked that, it's a pretty good indicator of what someone's doing in the garden. As you can see, there's quite a few samples that are very, very low phosphorus. There's some that are, less than it should be and would respond well to some fertilizer. There's a few that are right where they should be, but you can see from the graph, there's a whole bunch that just have way more than they possibly would need for what they wanted to grow. And that kind of, bears what I saw. So this tells me that they're having a problem in the garden, but the concept of looking at it like this is a recipe and I need to add, X to get these great tomatoes probably isn't the right way of thinking about how you should be gardening. So don't look at it like as a recipe for a single crop. I think a better way of thinking about how we would garden is to instead focus on improving your garden soil overall through the whole garden and having healthy soil, and fuss less about a particular single crop. I mean, I know that if you really have a passion about tomatoes and that's your focus, that might be what you're looking at, but the tomatoes are part of your garden and not the sole reason for gardening. You need to consider the soil. So hopefully, if this presentation, we can give you some tips to help you with that. So let's talk about improving our garden soil and not talk anymore about Dustin's philosophical musings about gardening. The first thing that I would suggest to be successful with having healthy soil in the garden is to really understand the situation that you're gardening in. Like farms tend to be in places where the soil is favorable, but a lot of us don't have the luxury of living in a spot where it's really good farmland, or just it might be not favorable for the thing you like to grow. So learn about the soil that you have. Go out into your garden, get your hands dirty. I mean, literally go and pick up the soil, smell it, feel it, look at it, see what it's about. Is it got rocks in it? Is it really heavy sand? Is it sticking to your hand? Go and learn more about it. And there's some things that I think that every gardener should really know about what their soil has. I think that you should know something about the soil texture. In other words, is it sandy or is it full of clay? What's it feel like? How does it going to hold nutrients or not hold things? Find out about the salinity. Many people, especially those of us here in the desert, have issues with salinity in our soil. Many soils have some interesting characteristics. Those could be like you've got, cobbles in your soil or rocks, or maybe you've got a specific layer that might be down, a foot and a half that's impermeable, and that's going to affect drainage. Things like that you should find out about your soil. You should know your soil pH, whether it's acidic or it's alkaline. There's a huge amount of variability throughout California because we're such a large state. Generally in the West, we tend to have somewhat alkaline soils, but that's not the case everywhere. My county here in the desert, I've got acid soils, I've got insanely alkaline, and I've got some that are just pretty much neutral. It's like kind of like growing hydroponically. And then find out what usually grows there, both native plants and what kind of crops people are successful with. Find out what your neighbors have had good luck with and haven't had good luck with. I mean, that's just a matter of meeting people and finding out. But there's other ways you can find out about your soil. And one that I really like and I want to share is called the Soil Web app. And this is easily found by going to Google and typing soil web all as one word. There's a link there and that'll be shared. But I just type soil web, and it's going to work kind of like any of the mapping programs that you use to get directions somewhere on the internet, like Google Maps or MapQuest, if that's still a thing. And you type in the address of the place you're interested in, and you can be kind of vague with it as long as you have the town in. And then you just take your mouse and you click on the spot. And what's going to happen is you're going to get a little box come up. In this case, the soil where I've clicked is called Forbesville. And don't read anything into the names that soils have. They're just a name. It doesn't tell you anything. But what this program will do is if I click on the link at the left that says Forbesville, it's going to tell me all about the characteristics of that soil. The first thing it's going to show me is this cool little horizon of the soil as it goes down through the depths. And it's going to show the color of the soil, usually when it's dry. It's going to show you the different layers and how deep they are. But what's cool is over to the left, there's going to be buttons you can click for like the sand content of the soil. You'll be able to find out as you go down how the sand changes, or the clay, or the pH, the salinity, what's the EC. It'll tell you all sorts of stuff. But if you're not a soil guru and these are just numbers to you, you don't really have to worry too much. There's a little thing you can click in the top corner that says description, and it's just going to give you text. It's going to tell you like a little essay about that kind of soil. And this is just an excerpt for some of it. And I don't have to know anything about, you know, all those percentages of sand and silt. I can see that it's a loam, right? So I know it's going to have a nice mix of sand, silt, and clay. As I read through the description, it'll tell me things like where the soil comes from. It's going to tell me things like the pH. It's going to give a description of a typical thing that soil grows. In this case, it's a wine grape vineyard. It's going to talk about the native vegetation. I seem to recall that this soil grows like blue oak. So it's going to give you some interesting information. That's a good place to start. And you're probably going to find as you look up information of the soil, or you just work with your soil, that your soil isn't perfect. It's probably better than these people in Tacoma that have a pH of 9.7 and salinity so high that I couldn't make my meter work on it. But it's going to have some defects, and that's really normal. Very few of us live in soil that's naturally perfect. And over the years, there's been about 4 things that people tend to complain about with their soil in their garden. One is there's too much clay, and oddly enough, I get that complaint here where I have almost no clay soils. But a lot of people do have clay soils. I get complaints about things being too sandy, which is a really common problem we have here. Compaction is a very common complaint. People complain that their garden continually gets compacted. But probably the most common is they feel like there's something just missing in their soil. And hopefully, when we look through some of the tips that are coming up, all these tips will address these 4 major complaints in the garden. I mean, they're not necessarily 100% curative, but if you're following these tips and you're having healthy soil, these all become less of an issue. So let's look at some healthy soil tips. First, I want to start with talking about what healthy garden soil is. And anytime you take a soil class or go to a soil lecture, it usually starts with what is quality soil. And there's usually this big slide that's got a bunch of text on it that, depending on who writes it, it can be very technical or it might not be. But I like to think about it really simply, what makes healthy soil. And to me, the number one thing is it grows plants. That's what I want soil to do. I want it to grow plants in my garden. But to do that, it needs to be able to hold adequate water, nutrients, and air. And a lot of soils may have a deficiency in their ability to do that. Really healthy soil, to me, should really support an abundance of soil life. And that can mean things like worms. It can mean insects. It can mean microorganisms like fungus that are helping to break down stuff. And then finally, convenience to work in. So if I have to get a mallet out to bang a trowel into the ground, it doesn't matter if I can hold water and nutrients. It's not going to be a nice soil to work in. So to me, the friability of the soil and how easily I can make it do what I want it to do is definitely an asset. There'll be people that have different philosophies about what healthy garden soil is, but to me, these are the 4 things that are easy to explain to people that really seem to work for gardening. So my first tip is I think you should designate permanent paths in the garden. Not everybody does this. Probably the vast majority of people who put in a garden do not. But permanent paths are a fantastic way to decide where you're going to have compaction, because you're probably going to get compaction in your garden. You can either decide where that compaction is going to happen and make paths for that, or compaction will happen wherever you naturally interact with the plants all on its own. This is the Oregon Trail. It hasn't been used in 150 years, and you can still see wagon ruts that go through here from the compaction on it. People taking the same path, compact the soil. And obviously this is an extreme example, but you can see that compaction has had a major effect on plant growth. To this day, you're not getting growth back into those ruts. Compaction, essentially keeps permeability from not working correctly. It keeps oxygen out. It makes things so tight that roots can't get in. The temperature can go up and down a lot because there's not a lot of capacity to insulation from air trapped in the soil. So it can be pretty extreme, and we don't like this. This is something that happens in all our gardens at some point, and we have to somehow manage. So I feel that I'd rather designate where people are going to go and control that that compaction rather than have to deal with it all over the place all the time. So there's two common patterns that happen with compaction in the garden. One is when we tend to grow our plants in long rows, and this is a really common way to garden. There's nothing really wrong with it, but it makes like a little farm, and it's attractive, and it's what we think of as a nice, neat garden. But when we garden in long rows, as we walk down the crop to do things like pull weeds, inspect for insects, harvest, watering, we are going to compact the soil as we move through the crop, and that is going to limit, access to the roots to the nutrients in those areas. It's going to affect air and water movement, and we all encounter this, and we usually have to deal with it in the garden. The other pattern of compaction is when we have, say, maybe a block-shaped bed, and we don't provide a permanent place to go to or a path, is we get scattered compaction all through that as we reach in different places every time trying to get into the garden, and it makes a more subtle effect, but yet it's still there, and over time you'll get places in the garden that tend to be compacted. This is a new garden that was put in, and if you looked in the middle of it between those two rows, you can see that it's kind of like a furrow has formed there. And when this garden was put in, the entire thing was tilled up and it was completely level. And over time, through walking down the path, to get into the crop, it has created this little gully that runs through there and compacted the soil. So this is usually dealt with through tillage. And this is the same garden the following year. And to address some of the compaction problems and other issues in this garden, it was covered with a mulch pretty heavily. And this does help with compaction substantially, but there's not a permanent path there. And I'm a little overweight, and if I'm going to walk over this thing 4 or 5 times, I'm still going to end up ultimately causing compaction in spots. And so it's going to have to be dealt with. And sure enough, at the end of the season here, what this gardener did is essentially remove all the irrigation, remove the mulch, till it up, and spread the mulch back. That's how they decided to deal with the compaction that develops through just working in the garden. And tillage is usually how we address that compaction that happens annually. But we'll discuss tillage more a little bit later. But tillage has its own consequences in the garden, so it needs to be done right if it's being done. In this case, I get the sense that this person is tilling in soil that is probably a little bit too wet. And he's also, you can see, compacting the soil as he's tilling by following the tiller there. So there's kind of 2 strategies that I look at for putting in permanent paths to prevent compaction. I mean, you're going to get compaction where the path is, but essentially you're sacrificing that permanently, and then concentrating your efforts on not having compaction in other areas in the garden. And the first of those is to define a path using something like steps or a bark or something that the path itself is clear where you walk. And this is the approach that a lot of public gardens take. This is in Tulsa, and there's a really nice, flagstone path that directs you where you need to be and where you shouldn't be. And this is nice for like perennial crops. It gives a place where you're going to go to. But there's also a tendency, if you use something like bark or gravel, where there'll be intermixing at the border between the two, and you may not want that. And also, you have to have a strong psychological barrier to keep you from going in, like in this case, grasses or perennial bushes. If it's just plain old soil, you may be tempted to go and step in and squish that bed further on, and that may not be a good idea. So that's one option. The other, to me, is probably more practical in most gardens, and that is to use borders to define your pathways where you're going to sacrifice to compaction. And these are raised beds, obviously, and that's probably my favorite way to do it. When we have the little wall there, aside of the benefits you get from raising a crop, where you can make it easier to have better drainage and a little easier to work with, it creates a nice barrier between this is the area where I can stand and this is the area where I can work. And you don't get intermixing. This person has pea gravel that they walk on, and I would really hate to have pea gravel right next to my garden bed without any kind of border. And that's just asking to incorporate gravel into your garden over time. But it's fine when you have something like this. And in fact, it doesn't even really matter if you have anything. A lot of gardens that I've been to that have raised beds just use grass. So that's fine if whatever you want to do. But I think there's like some genius, person sometime in the past who decided that we should call these beds. And, because, we already have like an association what beds are for. And to me, like, I don't know about your mom, but my mom was really big on bed care. Like I could not jump on the bed no matter what. And your mom was probably the same way. And so it's really easy for me to remember, jumping on the bed and translate that into don't go into your raised beds. Don't step on them. Don't jump on them. Stay out of that. And that's just kind of like a nice mnemonic to remember. But I think you can actually go a little bit further with that whole analogy. So I think it's worth thinking about treating your beds in the garden kind of like the bed that's furniture. And that's my next tip. So treat your growing beds like an actual bed. And what I mean by that is, obviously don't stand or walk on them. But I know my mom and my grandmother were obsessed with me having a perfectly made bed that was neat and tidy. I mean, maybe a burglar would come in and see a messy bed, and that would just not be good. So keep that same logic and apply it to your garden beds. Keep it neat and tidy and pull all the weeds. And then keep your beds made up. Instead of covering with a blanket, let's cover with an organic mulch instead. I think that's a good practice that's really going to help improve the soil in most of our beds. So my mom was right, just not really so much in my house. I'm still not real good about that. But gardening, I'm pretty good about keeping my beds covered. This is me a few years back when last time I had an actual decent garden. I'm renting now, so I'm not quite so keen on spending money. But what I've got going on here is I've got my pathways, which are covered in chipped wood, which I could get for free from a tree company. So the ground is covered with that. I've got raised beds, so they've got wooden borders so that I do not step in the beds. I've made the beds narrow enough that I can reach them from both sides, so I've never have a reason to step in the bed. Mostly I'm weed free. At this point I don't have any Bermuda grass, so I was pretty happy. And then I've got mulch on all my beds. In this case, I've used cottonseed hulls. In the southern U.S., cottonseed hulls are an inexpensive, fantastic mulch to use in the gardens. It's a little more challenging to find them in the West Coast, but there's other options you can use for any kind of mulch that excites you. The key is, for this type of gardening, I like a mulch that breaks down relatively quickly and decomposes. And what I would do annually is just add more mulch to it to replace what had broken down. I didn't really have to do any tillage or anything like that. I would pull out whatever was done, add more mulch, and plant into that. So that's kind of the idea there. And the reason why I like these mulches that can break down is as they decompose, they replenish the organic material that's in the soil. And having organic material in your soil it's really beneficial. And in fact, that's my tip number 3, is we should add organic materials to the soil. And if you're interested enough in gardening that you're watching a talk about healthy garden soils, I'm sure you're already aware that there's good benefits to adding organic matter to your soil, and you probably are adding something like compost already. But I want to go a little bit further than that. So there are a lot of benefits to organic materials in our soil. Hopefully these aren't new to you, but one of the things it can do is if you've got really loose, sandy soil, it can help improve water holding and nutrient holding capacity. It's a reservoir, a supply of that. But likewise, if your soil is too clayey, and maybe prone to compaction, it can help loosen the soil and make it more friable. There's a saying that's common in gardening that it doesn't really matter what the problem is, compost is the solution. That's probably an exaggeration, but there's definitely some truth to it. So adding organic material really helps with those problems. So that's 2 of the common complaints that people have in gardens taken care of right there. One of the other benefits is it promotes soil life, the good stuff. It's going to help, give food source to all the little microorganisms, the insects, the worms, to keep a good soil web going in your soil. So that's another great benefit. When you have lots of stuff going on, it improves decomposition, it's going to release nutrients, and it's going to make it an antagonistic situation, hopefully, for the pathogenic organisms that could be in the soil. If you've got an abundance of good, there's only a fixed amount of resources, maybe they will dominate. And then I have the sense, just through experience, that it feels like soil that has a rich amount of organic matter is more resilient. There's a lot less micromanaging that's involved, and more focusing on just the garden, and I don't have to worry about particular details about specific crops so much, or maybe I'm late getting off work, and I got a little more flexibility with watering than I would have if it was just the bare sandy soil that I have otherwise. So there's been research in the benefits of organic matter, but to me, I look at that as resiliency. That's how I think about it. So the first obvious thing that we add to gardens for organic matter is compost. And compost, it's decomposed, formerly living stuff. It's a great source of adding organic material, but it probably shouldn't be the only thing that you're considering using as a source of adding biological based organic material into your soil. It's good, but over time, you can definitely build up an excess of certain nutrients like phosphorus and potassium. And one of the reasons why I got a lot of those soil test results that came back that were high in P and K is because they had been adding organic amendments for so many years that they had built up an excess. And you may find that you don't have enough nitrogen for some crops if you're strictly using compost. So you want a richer variety of things that you're adding into the soil, and not just rely on adding compost only. In my area, we don't really have a source of compost unless you make it yourself, because I'm in the middle of nowhere and it's a desert, right? So a lot of people here will use some sort of manure, and it's been used for centuries, and it can work as a good nitrogen source, but there's definitely some issues with using this. I mean, for one thing, you need to make sure that you have plenty of time between the application of any kind of manure and when you harvest, just for food safety. And it's easy to end up with too much of some nutrients and not enough of others, and you have to kind of be on top of it. It's really easy to put so much in that your plants either have a lot of salt, or you get too much nitrogen. So it takes some finesse there. I put some information in the link. Don't try to type that. It's really long, but they're going to share it with you. With information about organic production and using manure, but I find that it's a pretty good resource. It's really simple to understand, that it works well for gardeners too. But beyond just manures and compost, there's all sorts of interesting amendments that can be sources of organic material. I just wanted to point out 3 here. One is feather meal. It's a byproduct of the poultry processing industry, and it has nitrogen in it, but it's very slow release. So it's a nice thing to add in addition to other sources of organic material, so that you have a reservoir of nitrogen that's very slow to be released. So that's something to look at. Worm castings have to be on any kind of discussion about soil, because they're just fantastic. They're great, especially if you have your own worm composting system set up, but they can be kind of expensive if you have to go buy them. But another one that a lot of us who don't have access to a lot of organic material might consider using is finely ground leaves from your landscape. Not every species is appropriate for that, but I found that mulberry seems to work very well, and mulberries are extensively grown through California. So that's something to consider. I've been using ground up mulberry leaves in my flower beds for years now, and they break down relatively quickly, and it's a mulch, right? And then it just gets replenished every year when I get more fall leaves, and it's really helped the beds. I have fewer weeds, the plants are looking better, and it's something to consider using in your garden as a mulch. I have incorporated them into the garden in the fall before and tried that out, and mulberry seems to be okay, but some species of leaves, when I try that, it just isn't necessarily, doesn't work well for us, at least in my climate. So it's something to probably look at mostly as a mulch or to compost. It's probably worth pointing out not everyone is aware of this, that if we add something that is essentially just carbon, like cellulose, like sawdust, or wood shavings. I was at a garden once, and they got some stove pellets that had gotten wet for free, and they incorporated them in the soil. If we do that, we can tie up nitrogen, and then your plants won't have access to it. And this garden I went to, nothing was growing, and they couldn't figure out why. And they were very proud of all the stuff they'd added. And what had happened is they needed time for that. Basically, what ended up being sawdust to break down. So over time, that can be fixed as it decomposes. If you add some nitrogen source, you can speed that along. So what I would say is, if you have access to something that's just pretty much nothing but cellulose, to compost it first before using it in the soil. But here's something that I really wanted to cover in the adding organic material, is to grow cover crops. And I'm always surprised how few gardeners really embrace the idea of cover crops. To me, I like growing things, and I hate shoveling. So this is really easy to latch onto. Put some seeds in the ground instead of like carrying heavy stuff and going to the store and buying bags of some kind of amendment. So consider growing cover crops as a way to incorporate organic material into your garden. This leads to my next tip, is to make sure you practice rotation in the garden and try to include cover crops with that rotation. And hopefully gardeners on the call are familiar with the idea of rotating crops. But just as a quick review, what we don't want to do is we want to stay away from growing the same thing in the same spot year after year. Many gardeners call me with tomato questions, and they always grow their tomatoes in the same spot. I mean, maybe that's the only spot in the yard that gets light. I don't know, but they always grow it there, and they tell me, I've been growing it there for 20 years. I've never had a problem, and it's just not working anymore. And that's from a lack of rotation. If we don't rotate, we mine the soil of nutrients in a certain place that tomatoes like to get them, or whatever the plant is, and we can also build up pathogens. There's a link that I've included with this that from the Master Gardeners in Napa County that have some information about rotation if you're not familiar with it. But a better way of doing it is to grow different crops one after the other. So, maybe carrots, then garlic, and then squash, and then maybe, next fall follow it with, like growing a mix of vetch and cereal rye as a cover crop, and then follow it with tomatoes. So you're trying to vary what you're growing with unrelated plants, but then incorporating a cover crop with it. And we can do a whole talk probably about cover crops, but there's not time for that. So it's something you can do some research on, or ask your local master gardeners for ideas of rotations with cover crops that work in your area. Just some ideas to consider, though, if you have that discussion with your master gardeners, you go to the library or just do some research on it. Consider adding legumes to add nitrogen to your soil. So this is a great way to get nitrogen instead of adding, necessarily buying fertilizer. You can use grasses to help scavenge nutrients that may be inaccessible to your other crops. And in fact, legumes with grasses work really well together. Or you may consider growing a smother crop, which is just a crop that grows really fast and shades out weeds. Like an example of that is, some people do buckwheat, or some of the summer grasses like, sorghum Sudan or something. But one thing I found that works really cool in a raised bed is even if I don't have success with this as a crop, is sweet potatoes. If I grow sweet potatoes in one of my beds, it grows really quickly once it gets warm, and it shades out everything, and it's pretty good for keeping Bermuda grass at bay. And there's also cover crops that do things like, they're tillage crops like daikon radish that can penetrate down deep into the soil. So do some homework and find out exciting things that you can add with cover crops. And this is going to lead to, my final tip. Now that we've grown this cover crop, what do we do with it, right? I mean, it's not something we're going to be harvesting, but yet we're growing it to benefit the soil. So how is that going to work? Well, you've got a couple options here. There are some people who garden without doing any tillage at all. It's a no-till garden system. And we even have that in commercial agriculture where there's no-till systems. And you can plant into the residue. This can be complicated, and every climate is going to have a little bit different combinations that can work. It's totally a doable thing, but not every combination of one plant following the other will work in every climate. So it's going to take some experience and practice to pull that off. But what I think most gardeners would do to approach this, how do we get the benefits of these cover crops into our soil, is probably to look at tillage. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about tillage before we wrap up for the day. And so my fifth tip is, if you're going to till your soil, let's do it gently. Let's not blast everything up and get the rototiller out every chance we get and go crazy. There's always consequences whenever we till soil. Now, we might be incorporating something like a cover crop or compost or something into our soil while we do it, but we're always going to be aerating our soil when we are tilling. We're going to be allowing oxygen to get down deeper. Many times the reason we're tilling is because we're not just necessarily concerned about incorporating something into the soil, but we're trying to break up the compaction that happened through the year. If we have lots of oxygen into the soil, we're going to have faster breakdown of organic materials. And so that's not necessarily what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to help build up healthy levels of organic matter and keep our microorganisms and soil life happy. So that's kind of at odds with each other. It's potentially can harm your soil structure. A soil has a natural structure that allows water and air to move through it. Hopefully your soil has that. But if we do our tillage inappropriately or too much, we can mess that up. We can till in really dry soils and just shatter everything. If it's wet, we can make weird clods and slick sides to our beds. We can develop over time a plow pan layer that's impenetrable. And none of those are things that we want to have. And then in any case, if we're taking a device that blasts through the soil and churns things up, or even if we just turn it, we are interfering with soil life. I mean, there's fungal hyphae that have just gotten broken up. I can't imagine a worm would like being chopped up by a blade spinning. Insects that may be breaking down things or feeding on stuff are going to get turned to the top. If you've ever tilled soil, as soon as you leave, like the birds all come, right? I mean, you brought stuff to the surface. Another thing you brought to the surface potentially is weed seeds. So if you've had a plot that maybe was once covered in weeds and you tilling it, you are bringing weed seeds up. Eventually, if you're on top of things, you can deplete the soil seed bank, and it may take years for that to happen. So you would have less, but at least in the short run, you're going to continue to bring weed seed to the surface. And if we are not tilling so much, we're going to have less seed issues. So there's always consequences to tillage. Now, I'm not saying don't till. I'm kind of agnostic with the whole till, no till thing. I think you can garden well either way. I own a rototiller. I often use it to put in a garden for the first time. My fuel line's been broken on it for a few years, so I haven't touched it. But I've got one, and so I'm not saying don't till. But I am suggesting, though, is when you do till, let's try to till gently. Here's a garden I used to drive past all the time, and this person's a good, dedicated gardener. There's they've had success in the garden. There's not really any problems going on, but they also were very avid rototillers. And you can see just visually some of the effects. The soil that this is growing on naturally is a forest soil it's well drained, but this has been tilled so much, you can see that there's water puddled in it in spots. It's not having the kind of drainage that it should have. There's almost no organic matter. You can kind of tell the pinkish color hopefully comes through the internet. Very little organic matter in that soil. And I know they added stuff. It's not enough. It doesn't stay. It's continually getting, turned to the surface. And this is a pretty hot place to grow things, and stuff happens quickly with breakdown. There's not many worms or insects in that soil. And then it's really hard to see on this picture, but where it says exposed ground and weeds, there's some green color back there, and it's weed seeds germinating. But fortunately, they've got a bench in the back so they can recover after rototilling that big old garden. If it were me, I would have permanent paths, and I probably wouldn't be doing all that tillage. But that's how they garden. So there's consequences to that. And these people, at least twice a year, rototilled. So gentler tillage means when you do have to till, let's try to incorporate some organic matter. That could be, what's left of your easy to break down mulch that you had on the surface if you want. It could probably, at that point I would hope that it is mostly already broken down. It might be a green manure, which your cover crop that you've turned in. It might be compost, but try to incorporate organic matter with that tillage when you do it. Another thing is make sure your soil is not too wet or too dry. There's kind of a Goldilocks zone where tillage doesn't cause quite as much damage. I like to, before I do any kind of tillage, is get my shovel, take a good scoop out of the soil, get my hands and kind of feel it. It should feel cool, definitely, because there's enough moisture that it's not burning up hot, but it shouldn't just crumble when I touch it, and it shouldn't necessarily make a clod. There's not really a defined easy way to explain that because everybody's soil is a little different, but you'll have a good sense if you go out and you squeeze it and it turns into a clod, that's probably not a good time to do it. So try to time your tillage so that the soil moisture level is good for that. And finally, experiment with using a shovel. You don't necessarily have to have power equipment to do any kind of tillage if you're going to get out there and turn soil. I have a rototiller and I haven't used it in a while. I put in permanent paths, which essentially shrank the size of my garden about 40%. So I had a lot less that needed to be tilled. So it wasn't really worth it to me to go get the tiller fixed. I just use a shovel, and my soil is loose. It's easy to work, and if I need to incorporate something, I turn it over. Some beds, I don't even turn them. I just go ahead and plant directly into it. And that's really the 5 tips that I wanted to cover. So just to reiterate, understand your native soil, what your soil problems you may have. Make permanent paths and designate where people can be and not be. Treat your beds like beds, cover them with mulch, keep them, free of weeds. Add organic materials, rotate your crops, and incorporate, some sort of cover crops into that rotation. And then when you have to till, if that's your thing, please till gently. And that's really what I have to present today. And I think we have some time for questions. So I'm going to close up my slideshow here so I can see what's going on. And I think that the folks on the other end of the call will direct the questions.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. If you're just joining us on any of the UC Master Gardener social media channels, you've been hearing from Dustin Blakey, who's the County Director, Farm Advisor, and UC Master Gardener Program Advisor in Inyo and Mono counties. And he's been sharing tips for Healthy Soils Week, tips for improving your garden soil. And we do indeed, Dustin, have a number of questions that have been rolling in. If you have questions, if you're out there on Facebook or YouTube, please type your questions into the chat on those channels, and we'll make sure that we get them to Dustin. So far, Dustin, the questions are falling into a couple different categories. One has to do with soil amendments, and then the other one has to do with cover cropping. So I'll get us started with the soil amendment questions, and then we'll go into cover cropping. So also, I want to say welcome to everyone. We've got folks joining from Lake County, from San Bernardino County, from Inyo and Mono counties, from Napa, from the Sacramento area. So I'm really all over the place. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Dustin, for speaking with the UC Master Gardener volunteers and the public. So this first question comes from someone in Lake County. They have a raised bed system and they have poor drainage in their area. So they brought in soil from outside. They said that their soil that they were able to bring in came with the soil analysis. And it's very high in potassium, very low in calcium. They added lime.
Yeah, so you may not necessarily have needed lime. There's lime is primarily added to soil to raise the to counteract acidity in the soil. And so if the soil you brought in, it probably was not particularly alkaline if it was low in calcium, but that's the usual use of lime. It adds calcium, but it also is used to counteract acidity. So, if actual calcium deficiency was an issue, there's other products that can be used for that, like gypsum and stuff that would have, necessarily the effect of, changing the pH. And then, plants do need calcium, but they don't need calcium in the same level that they need other nutrients in. And so that may not have been necessarily something that you needed to consider much, especially if you're going to be adding organic material that's derived from a plant that has stuff in it. I think in that case, I would let the plant response in my garden tell me whether or not I had a problem or not before I would start adding lime indiscriminately. And a soil test should have said whether or not lime was needed.
Thanks, Dustin. This next question is about adding fireplace ashes to the soil. This person is saying that they're burning only wood and newspaper, and they're wondering if that's
There's a reason why you might want to add that, and particularly if you have issues, again, with acidity in your soil, but that's not really a common condition in the West. And so I would not necessarily advocate taking your fireplace ashes and throwing them out in the garden. You can definitely have some chemical reaction that happens that could be unfavorable to plants. So, if you are an experienced gardener and you have maybe a deficiency in potassium, and then you've got a tendency toward acidic soils, in a moderate amount, that might be a short-term thing you can tolerate, but it's not something that I would really advocate, even if it was just plain old wood.
Okay, and last question for this little section on soil amendments. Thoughts on parasitic nematodes?
There's definitely, nematodes that would, be parasites and stuff. But the thing about soil life, there's a lot of products that are sold that things you can add to the soil. I mean, you can inoculate, legumes with rhizobium so they can, fix nitrogen better. You can buy, all sorts of activated living things to put in. There's stuff you can do, right? But the thing is if you are incorporating organic material into your soil regularly, and you're not destroying your soil with tillage that you don't need to do, you are going to get life forms going on in there anyways. And it's not necessarily clear whether what you add necessarily makes much difference in the real world setting in a garden where we're usually disturbing things pretty frequently. So, if you feel good about wanting to try it, I would say you're not going to hurt anything. But me, I'm cheap and I don't really want to invest in things that I don't really, may or may not work. I mean, if it's a guaranteed, it's going to be great, that might be worth it. But I would rather spend my money or effort incorporating the organic material and promoting just the soil life that really wants to be growing in my climate in my garden.
Great, thank you. And that probably is one distinction between a bed that we sleep in and a bed that we garden in. We're probably not adding parasitic nematodes to the beds that we sleep in.
I don't know. I probably should do laundry more frequently.
Yeah, if you have them there, maybe that's something to be aware of. Okay, question about interplanting of cover crops. Can cover crops be interplanted with corn and other garden veggies, or do they sort of have to be done in separate times and in separate spaces?
Yeah. I mean, there's experience with. You can do that for sure. There's nothing that says you can't. I mean, it's totally possible. Not every cover crop is compatible with every kind of other crop. I mean, corn and a grass cover crop doesn't really make much sense. They both are grasses and they have, that similar, root morphology that, adventitious type roots. I don't know that makes much sense, but it's totally possible. I mean, there's that whole, it's popular with gardeners, the Three Sisters gardens. I mean, that essentially is interplanting. And there's a lot of experience with interplanting. And I would say, yeah, you can do that, but not every combination is going to work. And it's not going to work in every climate. This is a very diverse state. And things that make sense in the Bay Area wouldn't work at all for me in the Owens Valley. So it's going to take some experimentation with that, but I would think it's worth trying.
Cool. And on the theme of cover crops, Rose asks, how would you suggest terminating cover crops? What do you typically do?
Well, I'm blessed in some ways that I live in the Owens Valley, and Mother Nature takes care of terminating my cover crops for me. So, if it's a cool season thing, whether I want it or not, it's going to die in the summer. If it's a warm season thing, come some point in November, it's dead. So, trying to pick a plant that works well with what you have with frost and your climate is one way of doing it. You don't necessarily have to, kill the crop to turn it in. I mean, you could, mow it down so it doesn't go to seed and as the hot weather comes and it's not so favorable to grow, if you're going to interplant into it, the other plant hopefully will dominate. You could, burn it down with a herbicide if that's what you choose to do. I don't ever worry about killing it because, like I said, it gets cold here. I just turn something in.
Great. Now a few questions that are on the topic of tilling, and then we'll go into some raised garden bed questions. So Diane from Santa Barbara, I believe, asks for guidelines for how to gently till. What do you mean when you recommend gentle tilling?
Right. So non-gentle tilling is like my grandfather did, and it is April 1st, and we're going to get the rototiller out, and we're gonna blast that garden up. It's your turn, DW. Go and work on it, and and you're tired and beat up, and so we would rototill that thing 3 times a year because he had a rototiller and it was nice, and he spent money on it. We're gonna till, and every time we tilled up that soil, it turned into powder. I mean, it was pretty rough on the soil. So gentle tillage is you're still turning the soil if you wish to, use tillage, but rather than just trying to shatter everything and break it up and mash it up like a blender, just get it turned over or incorporate something like organic materials so that I can, mitigate the consequence of burning up all my organic matter by adding oxygen to the system. So it's just till when you absolutely need to, rather than because the calendar says. Make sure the conditions are right, and try to make sure that as you till, you're incorporating something that it's organic, like a cover crop or compost or something while you do that.
So if you want to take a nap for a week, you've probably aggressively tilled rather than gently tilled.
Yeah. Or if you're really out of shape like me, it doesn't matter what I do. I'm tired.
Yeah, it's good. You touched at the beginning of this presentation on why we garden, and certainly our research on UC Master Gardener volunteers indicates that there are a wide variety of reasons, and some of them do have to do with that physical wellness and that sense of connection to land and soil. So we can experience that physical wellness whether we're gently tilling or aggressively tilling.
It's definitely psychologically satisfying to run a rototiller, I got to say. I mean, after you've done it, it looks beautiful, and you're tired, and you feel like I did something. I can see I did something.
Yeah, so there's that sense of working, that sense of immediate gratification. Right. But you're asking us to take a more holistic view, right. and I think that makes a lot of sense. Shelley asks, when would you recommend adding mulch and compost to raised beds? They garden in raised beds throughout the year, so any pointers that they should look for in terms of when they're adding those organic materials?
It's a good time to do it. Might be in the fall if you're not going to be growing a whole lot, or you're going to have a cover crop over the garden. But you can do it anytime between crops. I find, like with mulch, if I'm using a one that decomposes quickly, I add it continually as the mulch breaks down. In Arkansas, it's hot and we get a lot of rain there, and so I would find that the cottonseed hulls that I would use didn't necessarily make it the whole year. So I may have to get like another bag or so and just add a little bit, as the season would go. And I didn't necessarily add compost to the beds after they were established. I just continually added the more mulch and let it break down. And I didn't usually till it.
Okay, great. Helen asks, are pine needles considered something like cellulose? So if you want to use them, can you use them as a mulch cover?
They're great as a mulch cover. So don't worry as a mulch that it's going to be something's going to be there as a mulch. You don't need to be so concerned about the whole cellulose tying up nutrients in your soil. It's when you take something that's like just cellulose and you turn it into the soil that you're going to have that nutrient tie up. But as long as it's a mulch and it's on the surface, you don't have to be concerned with that. I mean, there's reasons why I wouldn't use sawdust as a mulch, but tying up nutrients, as long as it's a mulch, is not something that particularly concerns me. So I don't know that I'd really want to incorporate the pine needles. I think they're such a fantastic mulch to use on the surface if you have access to them and it's fire safe, that I would definitely want to keep them on the surface. I really love pine needles as a mulch. Great.
How about some other good cover crop options? What are your favorites?
Well, in my climate, I really like in the wintertime cereal rye and vetch. The combination together is good. And in the summertime, like I mentioned, I strangely enough, if I have raised beds, I use sweet potatoes. But we've had some experience here with our master gardeners using sun hemp and sorghum sudan, and we plant them toward the end of the season, and then frost kills them before they get too big, so that they're easy to incorporate, and we don't have to worry about trying to kill them off or anything.
Awesome. And if you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube and you have a favorite cover crop that you like to use, I think someone earlier in the chat mentioned that they like to use red clover. They just love the color of it. So help Alexa out and share your suggestions for cover crop options that you like. Lisa
Clovers
asked,
are great. Clovers are great. But you got to watch them not go to seed unless you really want them to keep coming back.
Sure. Yeah, you have to really love them, like the individual that suggested it. Someone is asking for suggestions for their community garden. What happens when you want to establish garden pathways and the mulch is way too high? Any suggestions for that, for establishing those permanent garden pathways?
Let's see. I'm not sure I really necessarily understand all the nuances of that question, but our community garden, we use locally available materials to make our garden paths. So around here in the desert, we have access to lots of decomposed granite, and it's not an ideal path material, but that's what we use. So try to use something that you have access to locally. If you're worried about that paving material moving into the garden itself because you don't have like a well-defined wall like from a raised bed, don't use something like little stones like pea gravel. Try to use something that's going to eventually break down into the soil or not really cause much negative consequence, or it's going to stay in place. So for us, we have pretty good luck with decomposed granite staying in place, and all of our beds pretty much have a border anyways. So that's how we address it. So you may just have to put a border in. There may not be a real good answer there.
Thanks. And we've got just a couple minutes left here, so we may or may not get to your question. If you still have questions that remain, please feel free to check out some of our other future live events that are on our website live series. And we had a wonderful virtual mini conference that was put on this year in lieu of our in-person conference that was supposed to take place in Tahoe. That's got a lot of great material. So if you're interested in Firewise landscaping, there's a great presentation from LA coordinator Valerie Burrell. Wonderful presentation from Kevin Marini, who's the coordinator for the UC Master Gardener program in Placer and Nevada County. So lots of other places to get those questions answered because we do just have a couple minutes left here. But I do want to ask one more question that we have from an individual saying, I've got really heavy clay soil. What do I add? What are some suggestions there?
The key is going to be to try to either, garden into raised beds so that you've added elevation, and then incorporate organic material. So compost is a good place to start. Starting to grow cover crops that are tolerant of the heavier soil. Some of the grasses do better with heavier soil, just to bulk up the soil with organic material. And the situation will get better. I mean, clay soil is clay soil, and it's never going to go away, but it becomes more manageable as you do raised beds and you incorporate more stuff. So you learn to live with it, and it doesn't become quite as much of an issue with adding organic materials. But there's no other like magic bullet, that's something you can sprinkle on that's going to make it go away. It's time, effort, and organic material.
Thank you, Dustin. And with that, I think we're going to have to close up our comments for today. Thank you so much, Dustin Blakey, joining us from Inyo Mono, the County Director, Farm Advisor, and UC Master Gardener Program Advisor there, presenting tips for sustaining your soil in your garden, celebrating Healthy Soils Week. Thank you so much, Dustin.
Right, thank you. Talk to y'all later.
Bye, thanks.